This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and so grateful to have this platform to talk about faith and politics and these really important ideas with really interesting people, accomplished people of goodwill, in good faith. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And hey, I have a favor, and I've asked this favor before, but I'm serious. Can you leave a review? Just go to one of the podcast apps, whether it's Apple or CastBox or Podcast Addict or Pocket Cast. There's lots of them. And you can write a review. It really does help if you do that. It helps get the word out so more people can participate in the conversation like the one we're having today with Matt Lewis. Matt Lewis is a senior columnist at the Daily Beast and the author of Too Dumb to Fail: How the GOP Betrayed the Reagan Revolution to Win Elections and How It Can Reclaim Its Conservative Roots, and his new book, which I recommend to everyone, Filthy Rich Politicians: The Swamp Creatures, Latte Liberals, and Ruling Class Elites Cashing In on America. You might recognize Matt from his appearances on MSNBC's Morning Joe, and prior to that as a CNN political contributor. Matt's also provided political commentary on Real Time with Bill Maher, Face the Nation, The News Hour, and Nightline, among others. Matt's writing appears in outlets such as The Wall Street Journal, GQ, The Washington Post, and Politico. As mentioned, he's a senior columnist for the Daily Beast, so that's where you get to see him almost on a daily basis. It's the prolific writing is remarkable. Matt previously served as a senior contributor for the Daily Caller, and before that as a columnist for AOL's Politics Daily. And Matt is also the host of Matt Lewis and the News, and is a co-host of the DMZ, along with Bill Scher, two great podcasts that I also highly recommend to everybody. Most notably, and this is not known yet, so I might be breaking news, Matt Lewis will soon be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. How you doing, Matt?
Great to be here. And man, when you put that resume together, that bio, it sounds legit. What is it? George Costanza had some line about if you took everything I did and you condensed it into 5 seconds, it's okay.
Yeah,
it's pretty good.
And that's just in the last week. I mean, I didn't get into the week before. So, but
is Huey Lewis in the news? Are they going into the Hall of Fame? Did I miss that?
Oh man, that would be appropriate because he's suffering from an illness where
he can't hear.
He can't hear. He can't sing. He's still functional. He's relatively healthy. It just affects his ability to play. So it would really be appropriate. But then again, he was like a local bar playing band guy, and he had that one big album, right, in the mid '80s. Or do I remember that right?
Sports. Well, there were really two pretty big. I know this because I just listened to a podcast called Political Beats, which is put out by National Review.
Okay.
And they have like a political person that will come on and talk about the entire catalog of a musician. I actually was the guest on the show talking about John Cougar Mellencamp. They just did one on Huey Lewis in the News, and I listened to the 3-hour or whatever long conversation they had about him. And I think it was really two big albums. I think it was Sports and Four.
Okay.
Fore.
Yeah.
Were the two that most of the hits came from.
So this is how, I have my blinders on. I literally just now put together Huey Lewis and the News and Matt Lewis and the News. I've been listening to your podcast for years, and now it occurs to me, oh, that's what that means.
Well, because, it's not a subtle, it's not a pun, right? Because Matt and Huey don't rhyme, so it's a subtle homage. I pay homage to him, I would say.
So that's a thing that you have. You pay homage, like both of your book titles are paying homage. I was trying to think of what the next book is going to be, and I was going to put in a pitch because I sent you that essay. I'm not nearly even remotely in your league writing wise, but I sent you that essay advocating to have the Gottheimer and Fitzpatrick's, to kind of take hold of things while they can. So your next book will be about moderates or centrists kind of taking over, and we'll call it instead of Barbenheimer, we'll call it Fitzpatrickheimer or something like that.
Well, I don't understand. It's a valid point. I mean, if six Republicans can take over the House of Representatives, why does it have to be these six?
Right.
Why couldn't it be another six who say, look, if you want our vote, then you need it. You got to have it, right? You got to have our vote. Then let's run it as a bipartisan operation, or let's do things a little different.
Exactly. The Problem Solvers Caucus has 61 members, evenly split. I think there's one extra Republican because Republicans have the majority. But if 6 or 8 Republicans can shut things down virtually, why couldn't a caucus of centrists or people who actually don't think, somebody with a different letter before their name is evil and Satan worshipers, we're all humans, we're all Americans. I wonder why a caucus that substantial can't take the reins and bring some sanity back to the House.
And what's the Yeats poem about the worst being full of passionate intensity, and the best? I mean, I think that the people who are sane and somewhat moderate and want to get along are not predisposed to take their team hostage. But maybe they should. Like, maybe they need to show a little leadership and say, oh, you need these other 6 crazy votes to get something done? Well, guess what? You're not going to get anything done without me either.
Right.
We're going to insist on sanity or else.
So here's a question, and this will bring it home. I don't know if you've seen this. I've seen it on a smaller scale where the very nature of my show, Talk Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. It is about collaboration and seeing people on a human level as opposed to putting on our partisan jerseys. You're very much the same way. I think you refer to yourself as an open-minded conservative. That's not something that gets nearly as many clicks as uniparty Satan-worshipping groomers. Have you noticed that every once in a while, if you have a headline or one of the titles of an episode is a little bit more pointed than what your typical fare is, do you get more clicks? Do you get more hits? And if so, is that just a little bit enticing for you to do more of?
I don't think it matters at this point for me. I think I've cast my lot. But I do agree in general that what works in this business as an industry that we are in, what works is picking a team and sticking with that tribe and not going back and forth, not trying to be nuanced. That's what works in terms of getting clicks, getting views, getting ratings, and all of that. And I've done the opposite, as have you.
Yeah.
So then now we're looking for – and see, the problem is I think the majority of Americans are where you and I are, but they're not obsessed with politics, right? And so the problem is that the niche of people, the audience, the fan base that is obsessed with politics have very strong viewpoints. And they see it as a team sport. You should either be on the right or the left. And once you make that commitment, you should be with that team whether they're right or wrong.
Yeah.
And that's not how I view it as a journalist. But sadly, that's what it's become.
Well, you're also in a unique position, and I'm curious if you experience this as well, where you occupy spaces. You grew up with people, I'm guessing, and now being based in West Virginia, whether it's people that are super, super engaged or people, say, from my church community. It's not that every single person that goes to my Bible study is watching Fox News all day, every day, or Newsmax all day, every day. There's certainly, a percentage of folks that are very engaged that way. They're the more, they tend to be the more extreme folks who have the more extreme views politically and socially. But because they are there, that's sort of the default posture, and it's like the mist in the air that we all walk through in certain circles. At the same time, like you probably have other bubbles, if you will, like your DC friends, perhaps, that are watching different news channels. And if they're not watching it all day, every day, they're in that mist or that silo, if you will. Do you find yourself translating for one crowd in West Virginia or at church and then translating for another crowd when you're in different circles?
Not too much, because believe it or not, I try not to talk about politics with people who are not in the industry.
You're like, I'm just here for the soccer guy. I just want to yell at the ref. Like,
because I live in West Virginia.
Yeah.
My kids go to Christian schools. I coached Little League a couple years ago. We go to a church out here. We go to not just a church, but we go to their picnics and their cookouts and all that. I have lunch about once a week with my mom and her sisters. She lives in Pennsylvania. And so I interact a lot with people who are very Trumpy and very, very into Trump. And then, of course, I go on like Morning Joe, and I go to D.C. every once in a while, and I still have a lot of friends who are more never Trump conservatives. So, but I would say that it doesn't really come in handy in terms of translating to people, friends. I think it really comes in handy as a writer, like the fact that I have this diversity of opinion that I'm not in I'm not just, maybe I'm in a couple bubbles, but I'm not just in one bubble.
Right.
I am hearing, and I think that definitely informs and helps me as a writer. I will say it is a real disappointment in one sense, which is that when you're growing up, you know, the one thing you want, if you're like me, you know, some people want to be famous and they want to be rock stars and all that. To the degree I ever wanted any of that, it would really be to like make the people where I'm from proud of me. You know, to make your parents proud of you, or the people where you're from proud of you. And that didn't happen because I'm not on Fox News. No. If I was on Fox News, I would have made them proud. I'm not talking about my parents specifically here, but family, I'll say broadly speaking, family and where I'm from, the thing that really, if there's anybody in the world you would want to impress, it's the folks where you come from. And by virtue of not becoming a Fox News right-winger, I sort of, you know, skipped that opportunity.
Oh, man. Yeah, that's something where it's still... Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So that drive from your house to Pennsylvania, you describe at the beginning of the book that you're both 45 minutes away from not a Bob's Big Boy, what's the diner that's 45 minutes away from both of you?
So this is in Hagerstown, Maryland.
Yeah. Where your dad was a prison guard for 30 years, right?
Yeah. I pass it on the way sometimes. If I take the Sharpsburg Pike into Hagerstown, I pass the three prisons actually right there, and he worked at all three at different times in Hagerstown. And it's Bob Evans is the restaurant. But look, I don't limit myself just to Bob Evans. There's an El Ranchero there as well. But that's where we meet oftentimes. And
so I was curious if you noticed, if you're able to see which way the wind's blowing politically by how many Trump signs there are out, you know, or how many Make America Great Again signs there are.
That I would say a few years ago there were not as many as there used to be when I first moved out here, and maybe I've just gotten used to it, but it was shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, there was even a Confederate flag that flew very near my house at a house. Luckily, I haven't seen that in a couple years, but that is truly ironic because I don't know if you know this, but the state of West Virginia literally seceded from Virginia. When Virginia left the Union, we left Virginia. So it's ironic that that happened. I will say that these lunches with my mom and her sisters serve as very interesting focus groups on what people think is happening, what Fox is saying, because it's a lot of Fox.
Yeah.
And there will be things that I will not have heard of that I'll hear from them at lunch. And then, of course, it's become like a big meme that I totally missed because it's only being said on Newsmax or something.
Yeah, there are certain things that are being said in a certain bubble. And I really appreciate having conversations with my friends who are, whether it's Fox News fans or get their information from other sources that I'm not tuning into every day. I appreciate that. Sometimes it frustrates me, frankly, because I'm like, I can't even engage with that because that's not even based on reality. Like that, I want to take you seriously, but I can't engage with that point because there's no factual basis to that. But I do appreciate because it's, you really are concerned. I live in a certain part of Southern California where it's close enough to the border where people feel it, people see it. It's affecting certain jobs in our area. So people are really feeling that, but it's maybe not something I'm paying as close attention to as someone who's maybe tuning into what's his name, Bannon's show every day.
Yeah.
So I was curious though. I kind of started off by saying how busy you are in this long resume. I was really curious though. How were you able to fit that in? A serious note, like, because you do have the 2 podcasts. I think it's about 3 episodes total every week between the 2 of them. And you're
give or take.
You're writing your column. I mean, I've seen at least 3 already this week. I think. And then your appearances. But you wrote this book. I would like. How were you able to work? Did you just say, okay, the kids go down at a certain time, and from 9:30 until 11:30 every night, I'll be writing on the book? How did you work that all in?
I feel like Homer Simpson, who said something about, I had a wife, 2 kids, a baby on the way, and I still found time for 8 hours of TV a day. Or George Costanza, who was pretending to be an architect, and he pretended to build to design the Guggenheim, and he's like, it really wasn't all that hard. Believe it or not, it really wasn't that hard. This week has been weird because ever since the coup, the Matt Gaetz, motion to vacate, the beast this has not happened much, but they've kind of put me on notice that it's all hands on deck. So my schedule's been out the window.
Oh, man.
But normally speaking, I have a schedule and I write 3 days a week. I write a column 3 days a week, which seems like a lot. If you talk to a columnist, they're like, that's insane. 3 columns a week. How do you do it? But that still leaves you 4 days where you're not doing anything. You're off, right? You're 4 days when you're off. And 2 weekdays, because I write Monday, Thursday, Friday for the Daily Beast. And part of it is the philosophy. I have to tell you, my philosophy of writing is like, even though I love writing, and at its best, I'd like to think that it's art at some level. But in terms of the work ethic, I view it as like, if you're a carpenter, you get up and you build a deck. And you might not feel like getting up. You might not feel like building a deck. But you are going to do it. And some days you build a cathedral.
Yeah. Every
Every once in a while you might build a cathedral. Most days you're just building a deck.
Right.
But you got to do it. And so that's the philosophy that I have. There were a couple of one quote was Andy Rooney, at least it's been attributed to him, where he says, if you're a writer, you don't wait for an idea. You sit down at a keyboard and damn well decide to have one. And that's kind of... I just sit. So 3 days a week, I sit down, and it's scheduled. It's Monday, Thursday, Friday, ideally. And those days, I decide to have an idea, and I write. And I'm also blessed to have people that I collaborate with who help me. And that was the case with my book. It's the case with my column. Some of those people are paid by the Daily Beast to be my editors or paid by my publisher. Some of those people are friends and just colleagues that I bounce ideas off of, help edit things for me, give me ideas. Bill, you mentioned Bill Scher.
Yeah.
He's an example of someone who I can pick up the phone and brainstorm with. But writing the book, you start to do the math and you're like, okay, I just signed a contract for this book and it needs to be a minimum of 60,000 words. That sounds intimidating, right? But then you're like, you do the math and you're like, okay, I've got 9 months to do that. And you're like, if I write 250 words a day, I've got a book.
Wow. Okay.
And you break it down and by how much do I have to write every day, and it becomes pretty darn manageable. Now, the truth is it doesn't ever actually work that way, but psychologically breaking it down into that bite size, that will psychologically it makes it less intimidating. I pulled 0 all-nighters. I took no time off from work.
Wow.
I didn't miss a birthday. I didn't miss an anniversary. I didn't, it was part, I just scheduled it. And I had a lot of awesome people who were helping me. It takes a village. And so it wasn't that hard. The hard part for me was promoting it. Once the book comes out, then I had to take time off, and then it was brutal.
So I'm going to give listeners a look behind the curtain. I was really surprised when I reached out to you, because I initially reached out right before the book came out on Twitter, but I stopped. I didn't stop using Twitter, but I stopped the frequency that I was going on, and then it just slipped my mind. I'm like, oh shit, I gotta hit up Matt in like a normal way, like either text or email or whatever. And it had already passed. And I reached out to Matt. And he's like, yeah, as long as you don't talk about the book.
So the way the people don't realize the way it works for 99% of the authors. This isn't always true. Some books have long tails. Some books break late and become hits a year after they come out. But by and large, for most authors, the only thing that matters is the first week or two when the book comes out.
So it's like an election, like opening a movie or like an election in a way.
It's like an election because you're, right these days with elections, you're banking early votes, right?
Yeah.
We're banking pre-orders.
Okay.
They count just like early votes. But then it's 2 weeks, and you throw everything you have, and every interview should come out during the first week of the launch.
Oh.
And if it doesn't, it's much less helpful to the author. And then frankly now, so my book came out July 18th, and that week, I was on The Young Turks. I was on Megyn Kelly's show. I was on Morning Joe. I was on, I don't even remember. I was on like Will Kane's Fox News podcast. I was on Andrew Sullivan's podcast. I was on Jonah Goldberg's podcast. I was on a lot of stuff. Yeah. CNN here and there. And I had the shtick kind of down pat where I could talk about the book. I could talk about the fact that, the average member of Congress is 12 times richer than the average American family. And I had all my talking points about filthy rich politicians. And now I could get through an interview, but I wouldn't be nearly as sharp as I would have been in July.
Fair enough. Well, the one thing that really jumped out at me was that this isn't the problems that you describe aren't exclusive to one party or the other. In fact, one of the illustrations that really was stark was the fact that people from the Squad, AOC and I forget if it was Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, are like they own real estate. So the particular version of the relief, the renters' relief that they were advocating for, really served their own best interests as real estate investors. Yeah. Do you remember that? If you remember that,
yeah. And this one is not the most egregious of things. I think the insider trading stuff is the worst. And as you noted, it's bipartisan, right? It's bipartisan. Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, and Richard Burr, a Republican, were the two worst examples of people who engaged in very suspicious trades that looked to be improper. But this was interesting too. I had a chapter called Latte Liberals. And in that chapter, we talk about, I forget which, there was two of the three, there's 4 Squad members. It was 2 of them.
Yeah.
It might have been AOC. It might have been Rashida Tlaib. But anyway, 2 of them. And they're landlords, and they make a pretty substantial amount of money off of rental income. And so during COVID, the Squad was pushing for a moratorium on rent. They wanted a moratorium on rent, and they wanted a moratorium on evictions. You couldn't kick anybody out if they weren't paying rent, and the people didn't have to pay rent. But they put in, they included a little rider that said that the landlords had to be reimbursed for this, by the government, right? They had the landlords, so the landlords had to be paid, which is interesting because at least two of them are landlords, right? So could be self-serving potentially.
Could be. Speaking of self-serving, I want to be self-serving for a second. I want to ask you, as a fellow podcaster, how you do your prep with that many, with a couple of different podcasts and being a guest on several. How do you prep for every? Because for me, if I'm having somebody on like you with a book, or I had Yasha Monk on, I had Robbie Jones on from PRRI, and I just see it as my job. Oh gosh, I'm having Yuval Levin on next week.
That'll be fun.
Talk about reading. I have a lot of reading to do over the next week.
Yeah, he's great.
So how do you prep? Do you feel like do you need to read the book if you're having somebody who has a book coming out, or is just being ensconced in the issues of the day? Are you on your game all the time, and your inquisitiveness is the preparation itself, or how do you prep for your interviews?
Well, sometimes I read the book. Sometimes I read the book very thoroughly, and in fact, several times I have been complimented by people who say, "You're the first person who read the book."
Yeah,
and they're delighted because they spent a year writing a book. They've been doing this media tour.
Yeah.
And I was probably the first interviewer. But it's really it's unrealistic to think that every interviewer can read the book,
right,
especially if you had a daily show. There may be interns who do it, and they are feeding you,
or whatever,
researching it. Yeah. So it's really hard, but ideally I like to read the book thoroughly and really do prep. But unfortunately, it's just not always possible. And so sometimes I will cheat and listen to podcasts.
I don't think
I've
that's
done that
cheating.
with your podcast.
Yeah,
before.
I don't think that's cheating, though. I think that's fair research. I mean, listen, if you're listening on 3 times the speed, not really listen.
I've done that too.
Yeah, just to get through it.
Not 3 times, but time and a half.
Yeah, time and a half is fair. But listen, that's just being resourceful, I think, is to listen to other interviews, especially certain kinds of interviews. There are some that are the 7-minute segments where it's just real quick hits that I don't think do us any favors. But to listen to you in a 90-minute interview with Jonah Goldberg, I mean, I'm going to get something from that.
And if you're, and I think, if you're a good interviewer and you're fairly smart on the topic and you listen to that, that's going to spark questions that he should have asked maybe that he didn't, or it's going to bring up original thoughts and original ideas. And so I love podcasts. I listen to so many podcasts, and that is one of my best ways of consuming information quickly. And I've always learned from listening.
Yeah.
I like listening. I was always a talk radio guy. And so that's one of my secrets. And then, there's different types of podcasts. If you have a book author on, then that's a heavy lift. That requires a lot of prep. And so I've started actually doing a little bit less of that, just honestly because I don't have the time to commit to it. But if it's something I'm already writing about that's in the news cycle and we're just going to talk, current events, then that's easy, And so there are people I just, I had a guy on the other day. I don't know if you know Tevi Troy.
No.
Tevi Troy, great guy. And he's a presidential historian. He writes books, but he also will very often write columns. So he just had a column that was basically about, people are saying Joe Biden should retire, like step down, kind of late in his presidency and retire.
Was he the episode that you released a couple days ago on the news? Yeah. So I did listen to that interview.
So that's an easy one for me to conduct. All I have to do is read a 750-word column.
Right.
And then Tevi's been on so many times that he and I have a pretty good rapport. So that doesn't take much prep work at all. And I think it's a decent product for the consumer, for the listener, that they're going to get something out of it. And I didn't have to read a tome.
Yeah. No, it's funny because I still feel insecure that I'm not going to be prepared enough. I basically have to earn my way into a conversation with someone who's at the top of their game, or, someone like you in terms of writing, or Yuval in terms of his erudition and his philosophical moorings. I feel like I don't really belong at the table, so I better over prepare so that I'm not a complete bust at the table.
I think you're just naturally good at this.
Oh, thank you.
And you're naturally curious about people, and you're conversational. But I would also say that it's healthy to feel like you need to prepare like a lot. Like, that's a good instinct. Yeah. I think if you lose that would be a problem. So, but it also for me it has also become, weighing the Daily Beast pays me, so that's a priority. I've got a wife and kids. That's a priority. And then if I get invited on TV, where I'm going to be seen maybe by more viewers than will listen to my podcast, so it's you're kind of rank ordering, like, how much time should I put in to prepping for a podcast? But if you're inviting Yuval Levin on, you kind of owe it to him to bring your A game too. So
absolutely. So I do want to go back to your columns for a second. Do you inventory ideas? Like, if an idea hits you, do you have a pad or something that you keep, or something you type, or speak into your phone or something like that? How do you keep track of what you're going to write? Or do you literally just sit down on your keyboard and the physical act of writing, ideas emerge that way?
As much as I hate phones, they're a godsend for taking notes. I never was the kind of guy who would carry a journal or a little notebook around. Yeah. And even though I should have, because you think you have an idea and you think you'll remember it, and you will not. At least I won't. Yeah. And so I have my phone with me at all times. I take notes on my phone constantly.
What about when you're driving? How do you do it when you're driving?
Oh, I don't want to admit this, but I pull over. I pull off the road.
Yeah.
I pull off the road and I take the note. And as I'm talking to you, I've gotten calls in the last minute from my mother-in-law and my wife.
I have to
keep calling. I'm going to have to.
In all seriousness,
if they keep calling, I'll have to take it because it's an emergency.
I drove up to San Francisco. My wife is she got a new job with United Airlines, and she's based in San Francisco. So any chance I get, I drive from here. It's about a 5-hour drive, and I listen to at least a half a dozen of your stuff from your shows, as well as interviews that you were on with other people. And I should have done that, because there were so many, to your point, during those interviews, there were so many questions. Like the interviews, I think, were consistently good, but there might have been follow-ups or threads that I would pulled on, and I really should have been better at pulling over, taking notes. So I was curious about that.
Driving's a great time to listen to podcasts, and but yeah,
it's a great time to take a nap too. Sorry.
No, but I will say, so I'm constantly looking for content. I'm constantly thinking, and I also keep notes of, like, because when you write a column, the most important thing is the lead and the kicker, right? The lead is like the first sentence, and this has become become more important, I would say, in recent years. There's a style of writing that works for outlets like the Daily Beast.
Yeah.
There's like a formula, and it requires a really good lead, the first sentence, and a really good kicker. And there are great writers in history who couldn't write a piece in this era for the Daily Beast. It wouldn't work. You know what I mean? Like they would have to change. It wouldn't. Like I have the picture of Joan Didion behind me here.
Yeah.
And if I turned in, she's one of my favorite writers. Her nonfiction essays I love, but if I turned in one of her essays, I'd be laughed out of the room, and they would mark it up, and it wouldn't fly. So I keep notes of, like, leads and kickers that will someday come in handy. A lot of them are actually song titles or like hooks from songs.
Yeah.
That will someday fit a political point or a political column. But the other thing I do is whenever, I write every Monday, Thursday, and Friday, I will also just sit down. I sit down at like 7 a.m. and I look at a ton of websites and including the Drudge Report and every other website. And then I will pitch my editor like 7 takes or 7 ideas.
Oh.
So it's hard to save up ideas. Like if I had a great idea, I would have used it last week in my column. So it's hard to sort of save up ideas. Every once in a while, there'll be an idea that's kind of, I don't want to say evergreen, but it's like a think piece that is not directly tied to, like, I'll give you like one example. So there was a poll that came out recently that showed, it was like a big NBC News poll that showed that Trump and Biden were effectively tied in the polls.
Yeah.
And I used that as a news peg, as like a permission structure to write a column about how we're a 50-50 nation. And we actually have been for the last 3 or 4 decades, and why that's actually a problem. And I don't know if you know this theory about the sun. Jonah Goldberg talks about this a lot. The sun party and the moon party.
Yes.
Like
the sun is in this, or the moon is in deference. I forget exactly how he put it, but you can describe it better than I could.
Well, so like when FDR was president, the Democrats were the sun party. The Republicans were the moon party. And so the Democrats kind of, they're at the top of the pecking order.
Right.
And the Republicans kind of know their place.
Yeah.
And have accepted it. And then during the Reagan era, Republicans were the sun party and Democrats were the moon party. It doesn't mean that you have every governorship or that you even have all three. You don't have to have all 3 branches to be the dominant party for an era, for a time.
Right.
And the benefit of that is you've sort of won the argument at that moment. And the other side realizes, okay, we better kind of get in line with the Sun Party. The problem right now, and the problem this has been, and Yuval will talk eloquently about this, much more eloquently than I can, but the problem with being 2 moon parties, which we've been for 3 or 4 decades, is that you always think the next election we're going to take over, so why compromise, why change? Simultaneously, you always think we're one election away from extinction.
Yeah.
And so we have to do crazy stuff to make sure, so so I was able to use that poll showing a 50-50 tie as a sort of jumping off point to say, like, but it's not just the presidential election that's all tied up. This has been, we've had this 50-50 problem for years now. And I was able to kind of write, I don't want to say a self-indulgent piece, but a piece that that sort of scratched my, nourished the soul of writing about maybe deeper political science-y stuff.
And to your point, so I've been mimicking the kicker. So to your point, in that piece that you're referring to, the kicker is 2 moon parties can lead to all sorts of dark places. But the question remains, when, if ever, will the sun shine again? It really, it lingers. It's like a long note that sustains at the end of a really good song,
Yeah. And I thought about there's a bad moon rising, or there's a bad moon on the rise, or here comes the sun. There's a lot of, and you have to be careful with the kicker, right? I mean, it could be too cute. Like I had one the other day, I think it was in my lead, where I said, and this is one that I've ripped off many times from Bruce Springsteen, but, they were talking about Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, trying to woo him into running for president. And so in my lead, I put something about, they're desperate for a savior to rise from these streets, or something like that.
Right. This week's savior is Virginia Governor Glenn. Okay, primary. Here it is. With Donald Trump continuing to dominate 2024 Republican primary field, some Republicans are praying a new savior will rise from these streets. It's great. Yeah. You
praying in vain, I should say.
you work in pop culture quite a bit. I think there was only one recent essay that I saw where I really objected to it. It was the one on DeSantis, and I think was there a Godfather reference in that, if I remember correctly? And I'm thinking,
Oh, probably.
please, come on, don't use Godfather, something as sacred as the Godfather, with something as...
Do you remember what it was?
I'll pull it up, because this
Okay.
DeSantis...
I mean, I'm certainly not above it. I'll tell you that right now.
I was saying before, your book titles too are all, these takes on too dumb to fail and or too big to fail. And
so filthy rich politicians always reminded me of Dirty, Rotten, Filthy, Stinking Rich.
Oh,
which is the name of a Warrant album,
right,
from the 1980s. But they didn't want to go for that title.
Well, I thought it was a reference to the Filthy Rich Asians, the movie from a couple of years ago. That's what it sounded like.
Yeah,
to me.
yeah. And then Too Dumb to Fail is obviously Too Big to Fail.
Right.
You know what would have been great is if people accidentally thought they were buying the Andrew Ross Sorkin book and bought mine, but that didn't
whatever it takes. I'm sure he'd get a kick out of it if that actually happened. Oh, so it was you referred to the back of the scene. Right, that's right. At the top of the piece, I could have been a contender. I could have been a somebody.
Okay, so that's all along the waterfront.
It's on the waterfront. So, by the way, this is completely off topic, but
it's Marlon Brando.
It's Brando, but it's also Rod Steiger. So, I don't know if I couldn't have told you this. I got to spend an entire day with Rod Steiger, and he told me how that scene came to be. And again, this is totally off topic, but if you're into it, it's really...
Bring it on, man.
So first of all, Elia Kazan was the director, a brilliant director. They were all from the group theater, so they all spoke this like method actor language. And Kazan had, in those days, instead of having a cab going through an actual neighborhood, they would put a cab on a soundstage, and behind the cab, they would play a film that was the old neighborhood, the scenery that they were supposed to be going through. Well, what happened was the film that was supposed to be playing behind Steiger and Brando, it broke. So Kazan just came up with something on the fly. He said, "Okay, I got it. We'll put Venetian blinds in the back window of the cab. Do the scene as written," because it was a beautifully written scene. This great writer from to his, I think he might. I don't think he's still alive. He couldn't still be alive, but he lived in Bucks County for a long time. Anyway. Both of them, by the time they reset the scene with the Venetian blind, they said, no, it just doesn't work, because there were references directly to what they were passing in the neighborhood. So they decided to improvise. And Steiger said, I knew Marlon was a good enough actor to really work off of a surprise. That one of their main teachers was this lady named Stella Adler. Give yourself a surprise so you can work off of it. It'll feed you. So he decided to give his friend...
Stella Adler was one of the great... what's the type of acting
Method acting. Yeah, she was
method acting teacher.
Yeah, she was one of the three main American acting teachers: Lee Strasberg, Stella Adler, and Sandy Meisner. And Stella was the one who really influenced Brando the most. Even though Strasberg tried to take, as Brando said, he'd take credit for the Son of the Moon if he thought he could get away with it. Anyway, Steiger brings in a gun. It wasn't supposed to be in the original scene, but he knew the scene would get to a certain point where Brando said, I'm not going to take a fall, because he's telling his brother, the boxer, to take a fall. So at a certain point, that's where the scene where you see in the film where he pulls out the gun. And Steiger planned for two possibilities. One is he would act scared and he would back down and the scene would go one way. The other reaction that he prepared for was Brando in his character would get angry and they would get into a scuffle of some sort. And he goes, but that... And after that, he was. This was like 40 or 50 years. I talked to 50 years after the movie. He was still pissed off about it. That motherfucker. He said he went a whole different way, and I broke his heart, and I wasn't prepared for that. And that's where you got so Brando. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. He touches the gun. He says, "Oh, Charlie, you was my brother. You should have looked out for me just a little bit. I could have been a somebody. I could have been a contender." That's where that line comes from. It was a total improvisation. Brando's reaction to Steiger pulling out the gun. And the kicker of the story was that everybody on set knew it was brilliant. So they did all the close-ups for Brando. But then he goes, but Brett, Marlon, we did all his close-ups, and he pulled the typical Marlon. He said, I can't think of any more lines today. So my scene, my close-ups, I had to do without Marlon there. I would have gotten the Academy Award if they did my close-ups with him. So anyway, it was a funny story, but really surprising. So I resented that you used DeSantis with such a sacred scene like that.
No, I want to push back. I think I think that was a good line. The premise of that column is that DeSantis was poised to be the front runner or a front runner, and he blew it. Right. So he could have been somebody. He could have been a contender. I stand by it. So I have a funny, somewhat funny story. I was used to do a lot of TV. And I always got to know the drivers, Yeah. And one of our drivers was this probably 6'6" African-American gentleman with a shaved head, super tough. Yeah. Super tough guy. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen the show Spencer for Hire.
Oh, yeah.
But he looked like, we called him Hawk. Okay. That was actually his nickname. Just a tough guy. And I was in the car with him, and this was right after who was the guy who played the Joker who died? Drug overdose.
Yeah, the guy from Australia.
Yeah.
Heath Ledger. Yeah.
So it's like right after Heath Ledger died, and I was talking to him about how like Heath Ledger had been, what's the name of that acting style? I can never remember. Method actor, and like. He said, "This is what tricked me." He goes, he's like, "What's that?" And I'm like, "Well, that's where you pretend that you're like, you pretend that you're the person. Like you're not just acting as a murderer. You are a murderer, and you could be for a year. You're a murderer, and whatever it is." And I'm like, I think maybe Heath Ledger went crazy because he was like living as the Joker for like a year or two. And I was going on and on. I couldn't think of the term method acting. Right. I think is what I couldn't think of the name, but I forget the details. This was like 15 years ago when Heath Ledger died, and finally I said to him, "It's method acting," and he said, "Oh, you mean like Lee Strasberg?"
That's funny. Yeah. And
by the way, doesn't Lee Strasberg plays?
He does.
Doesn't he play a character in The Godfather?
In Godfather 2, yeah. He plays Eli Roth. What was it? No, Hyman Roth.
Hyman Roth,
yeah. He plays Hyman. I didn't think he was particularly good in that movie, to be honest with you. But then I'm a Meisner guy, and there was a great Stella Adler, Sandy Meisner had a great rivalry with Strasberg. So literally the day that this was a story that I'd heard when I got to Stella's place, and it was like 10 years after the fact, but they said that the day that Lee died, Stella got up in front of all of her classes and said, a very, very influential man of the theater died today. You're thinking it's going to go a certain direction, and then she goes, it'll take decades and decades to repair the damage he's done. So, even the day he died, she was still bitter.
Is that why, like the Stella?
No, that was a Tennessee. That was Tennessee Williams line. So they. Wow, this is going on a whole. This is my other podcast. Tennessee was living in Connecticut, where there was like this retreat for the group. What originally was the group theater, it became the Actors Studio, but the group theater had this retreat in Connecticut. And if I remember correctly, if I heard the story correctly, Tennessee was he was vacationing there and then doing some workshops for the play that became Streetcar. It was originally a one-act play that he did that was called the Gin Game or the Poker Game or something. And it was that scene toward the middle of the play, that the one that we have now, where the guys are around the table playing cards. So it started out as this one act or a scene that Tennessee was working out, and he had this young, raw actor, Marlon Brando, go up to do the workshop, and that ultimately is what led to Brando getting the part on Broadway. It was his first big part. So so he when you workshop a play like that, the writer is sort of working off of what good actors are giving them, and they'll sort of shape the character around that. So I think that Stella was he allowed that scene to go to an extreme that he might not otherwise have allowed it to go, because he had an actor that had the substratum for that, that could support it truthfully. But that's just a guess. I'm such a student of those actors, those writers. I think that's such a contribution to our culture that's affecting all of theater and film today, to this day. So, wow, I didn't think we'd go in this direction.
Welcome to Film Talk with Matt and Corey.
Yeah. So, wow, we're already 15 minutes in, and we haven't talked about the Trump trials. We haven't talked about McCarthy getting ousted. We haven't talked about the primaries. Which direction would you like to go in all of 3 to 5 minutes?
We'll do a lightning round. We can cover all three.
Okay, so Speakerless House. What's your hot take on the Speakerless House right now? Which way do you think it's going to go?
If I had to bet today, I think Steve Scalise.
Yeah, if I had to take the favorite, I think that's the favorite. The thing that I would want to mitigate that bet is that he's not well. He's sick.
No, he's not. I mean, first of all, he was shot.
Yeah,
that's. And then secondly, I guess he has blood cancer.
He has blood cancer,
which was just diagnosed, or at least he went public with it like a month or two ago.
Yeah,
this is a fairly new thing. So
that makes me wonder if Elise Stefanik is positioned, but I don't know. Are they going to leave? It's like you leave all the bullets in the chamber if they leave the vote to vacate, or what's the term for it?
Motion to
vacate. If they leave that in there, we're going to see 2 or 3 speakers before during this Congress.
If Jim Jordan got it,
oh man, that column you did today on Jordan, that I think you were spot on. I can't see.
Thank you.
Yeah. So
I decided to make it. I decided to focus on the fact that he doesn't wear a blazer. He won't wear a sports coat as my lead, and is also a little comic relief, for a serious time.
So for the record, I did not read your piece by the time I sent you my essay with the reference to he threw his hat and his shirt sleeves in the ring. But that's the proverbial dog catching the car. Like, okay, so what do you do now? I don't see where that goes. I don't see where like his style is a very combative style, and it's like if I'm being most charitable, I'd say he is true to his ideals. He's an idealist in sort of a violent way, but that does not. So what? That's great for punditry, maybe. That's great for a podcast, perhaps. Not good for legislation. There's nothing that's going to happen with a Jim Jordan-led House except for more chaos and clicks and tweets.
And so I think there's 3 possible ways it could go if he were to become the speaker, which I think is unlikely but possible. So one way would be that he stays the Jim Jordan we know, and we end up having government shutdowns, possibly a default over failure to raise the debt ceiling, and we quit funding Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he stays hardline, and there are consequences. And then Democrats will own the vote that they made because they elected, or they ousted Kevin McCarthy, in my opinion. They voted for Matt Gaetz, or with Matt Gaetz, whether they like to hear that or not. That's option A. The other option is that Jordan becomes the speaker and then kind of assumes the awesome responsibility of being the speaker and governs in a more sane way. And then I think within that option, it could go 2 ways. Either they could try to take him down and he becomes the man, he becomes the establishment, or it's like a only Nixon can go to China sort of thing. Like, they'll give Jordan more leeway to negotiate and cut deals than they would have given McCarthy. So I think those are kind of the three possibilities.
I'm not optimistic that he'll do what we would call grow into the position. Although one thing about your piece about him reminded me that he's actually an accomplished dude. If you can set aside his shenanigans, especially since the emergence of the Freedom Caucus, in particular in the Trump era, if you can set that aside for a second, economics degree, law degree, 4-time state champion wrestler, 2-time national champion at the collegiate level. This is an accomplished person that if we accept, if we, again, set aside some of the very glaring shortcomings. But I just don't see him being that guy that grows into the position. I know I'm hoping for it, and there's probably less than a 1% chance of it happening. But for the Freedom Caucus to take the reins for something along those lines. But I to your point of what you said at the top is that there has to be some sort of coalition that gives enough cover to a majority of the majority, the Hastert rule, as well as enough representatives from the other chamber to make something happen that makes governing possible, where the people, the House members get back to the business of the people. So, but you're not as optimistic about that possibility.
No, but I would like to see it happen, but I'm not optimistic.
Okay, so real quick, Republican primaries, you're one of the few people who has voiced and articulated the possibility that Trump might not be the nominee. I've said that too, but we said it for very different reasons. You laid out a series of events where here's how this could happen, and you still admit that it's highly unlikely, but you're one of the few people. So do you remember the thinking behind that?
So you're saying there's a chance.
Yeah, right.
No, I think Trump is very likely to be the nominee. But if it were to happen, the way it happens is by virtue of the early states, right? We don't have a national primary. So the fact that Trump is up by 40 points or something in national polls is really irrelevant. If he loses Iowa, which could happen, Iowa has gone for people like Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum.
Right.
So it's within the realm of possibility. And then if he were to lose New Hampshire, and which unlikely, but because he's up big in both states, but it could happen. They tend to be contrarian and ornery up there. And then so now he's 0 for 2, right? Then we come to South Carolina. Well, in in New Hampshire and in South Carolina, independents, they're like open primaries. There are a lot of independents, and even I think Democrats could play. So you could imagine a scenario where Trump just loses these early states by flukes, by orneriness, contrarianness, whatever, and now at some point it's over.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember, like Joe Biden lost a whole bunch of states early on,
South
and
Carolina.
then was able to turn it on.
Yeah.
So maybe the reverse would be true for Trump, whereas I guess in a way Joe Biden disproves my point. I mean, one way of looking at it is you could lose a bunch of early states and then come back.
Right.
But another way of looking at it is that there at a certain point, momentum kicks in, and you could run away with it. So someone could catch fire by virtue of this primary process.
Right.
I don't think it's going to happen, but
I just think at a certain point you have to deal with gravity. There's a couple factors that the Republican primaries are ignoring certain realities, and at a certain point it has to be dealt with. There's still, so for example, if in particular the criminal cases in Georgia if that trial is held and he's convicted, Trump is convicted, that one in particular, there's no presidential pardon for that. So you're literally looking at initially a nominee, a candidate, and then a president that is in jail, that is literally a convict. So I think if and when that happens, the Republican Party is going to have to reckon with gravity, as I think of it. The other one, and it's another gravity thing. I'm using gravity as more like 2 + 2 = 4. Meaning that there are certain realities that we like to try to ignore, but they're realities whether you want to submit to them or not. The other one is, and I haven't heard many people other than Mike Madrid talk about this, is actuarial realities, meaning I forget what the exact numbers are, but I think it was by the time we get to 2024, 10 million baby boomers and silent generation members will have died, and 14 million. What is it? What my kids are Gen Z. Gen Zers will have turned 18. So 10 million, and the baby boomers and silent generation are a large majority are voting for are Trump supporters, whereas 18 to 25-year-olds, a vast majority are Democrats, progressives, liberals. So that's an actuarial reality that isn't being factored into a lot of the analysis that I'm hearing now. Yeah. So those two.
Well, and I think part of the problem is that although that is gravity, and although that will catch up to us, because of the Electoral College, it may not matter in time for that part may not matter in time for 2024.
Yeah.
Because a lot of those young people live in California, which is already is irrelevant.
Yeah.
There could be 1 billion kids turning 18 in California tomorrow,
and it still doesn't matter. It won't change.
It wouldn't
election.
help. It wouldn't change.
Yeah,
I do think. I will say my guess is that the way it'll work with Trump is at someday, and it might be after he's been elected again, but at some point I think faith in him will collapse, and I don't think it's going to be like a matter of accretion or like that it's going to happen. I think it'll just like happen, right? Like a tipping point where like at some point all these crazy things have happened. It's never hurt him. It's never moved the needle. And then support for him will collapse all of a sudden. And it'll be like, well, I'm surprised. Why what happened? And you're like, what are you talking about? He's been indicted 4 times and he's been impeached twice. And you'll be like, I know, but he was really popular after all that stuff happened.
Well, so Trump could speak to that. He has a lot of experience with bankruptcy, and that's how they describe bankruptcy. It's very gradual until it's very sudden.
I think that's Hemingway.
Is that Hemingway?
Yeah, it was How Do You Go Bankrupt? And
I'm telling you, man, you with your cultural references, I thought you were going to maybe not today and maybe not tomorrow, but someday. So I can't believe I have hardly even referred to my notes. I swear I prepared 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 pages of notes. We didn't get to any of it. Okay, last. Was there anything important that I did need to ask you about that I haven't asked you about? Is there anything you want to say? Because I have a couple more questions and then we can wrap up. But I want to.
No, and to be honest with you, because I write about politics and talk about politics so often, it's a pleasure to talk to someone about pop culture. So this has been a pleasure, but no, feel free. Shoot them my way.
So I don't think last time I was asking what I call the TP&R question. And that is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with? And you could speak to this better than just about anybody I know because of what we talked about before, occupying 2 very different bubbles, if not more. So what do you think each of us can do to be better able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences, people who think differently than we do, have different beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do? How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
I mean, there are probably 100 things we could do, but one that just comes to mind right now is to follow stuff that's not politics, right? So, like right now, I'm a big Baltimore Orioles fan.
I see. Yeah.
They're going to the playoffs. So I could talk to someone about the Orioles if they were. I could sit next to a Marxist at the game and buy them a beer and a hot dog, and I'm sure we get along fabulously because this tribe not the Cleveland Indian tribe, but the team.
Yeah.
Right now, it means a lot, right? And so, if you are fluent in TV shows and sports and other things that you can talk about, you don't have to just talk about politics. Then that's one thing we could do. Be interesting, be interested, be curious. Read. Don't just, even if you're a progressive, don't, just because the other people are in their bubble, try to get out of your bubble a little bit, including the stuff you're reading and watching.
That's what Bob Costas said on the Great Baseball documentary. He said, when I couldn't talk about anything else with my father, I could still talk about baseball. And it's true. I lived through that. When I became a Christian, I don't know if we ever talked about this, but when I became a Christian, man, those first 3 or 4 years were really fraught. And my relationship with my dad, especially at that time, was really, really important to me. But those were hard conversations, but we could still talk about the Mets.
I just watched, or I think rewatched actually, but there's a ESPN 30 for 30. It's a 4-part series about the 86 Mets. And man, I mean, we're talking Lenny Dykstra, Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry, Ray Knight, Keith Hernandez,
Kevin Mitchell, Darryl, I can name that whole team. Gary Carter,
what a team!
Keith Hernandez, Tuffle and Backman were at second base. Santana was the shortstop, and Kevin Elster came up for the playoffs. Third baseman was Howard Johnson.
Gary Carter.
Gary Carter was behind the plate. Outfield was Darryl Strawberry. Mookie Wilson and Dykstra were in the outfield. For the first part of the '86, they had George Foster. They traded him away, and that's when Kevin Mitchell started playing left field. What a team! And then obviously Doc.
That's if you haven't seen it.
No, I've seen it. I've seen it.
It's good. And if you read, is it Jeff Pearlman who has the book, The Bad Guys Won or something?
The worst team money could buy until 2023. But I think 2023 is quite different than I think that was the 91 or 92 team. But okay, any questions for me?
So I was going to ask your team, but are you okay? Are you still a Mets fan?
Die hard. Yeah,
that's good.
And I'm dying hard right now. It's So Baltimore.
So you haven't adopted the Dodgers or
no. I mean there are teams that I appreciate their style of play, and there are teams that I would gravitate to once the Mets are out of it. But I can't. I mean it's like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it's almost like a tree that's planted in certain soil. You can't just uproot that tree and move it to a whole other coast in a whole other microclimate. It just doesn't work. And, especially if there was a team that was good all the time, I wouldn't know what to do with myself.
No, I mean, I think it builds character.
Yeah.
A little suffering,
I respect people that have been rooting for the Cubs, rooting for the Boston Sox, rooting for the Orioles. I mean, the last time the Orioles were good, it was, I think Jim Palmer was on the team. Or, I mean, you had stuff to root for in the mid-'90s when Cal Ripken was going for the streak. So there have been some things, but for the most part, I mean, it was the early to mid.
They had a good run with Buck when Buck Showalter was managing them.
Yeah.
In the 2014, they had a few good years.
Yeah.
But the last time they went to the World Series was '83.
'83.
So
yeah,
it's been a minute. And Brooks Robinson just died.
Oh, that's right, a couple days ago. Yeah.
So that is kind of now, giving them an additional something to kind of play for. His legacy, his memory.
Speaking of which, so my argument for Keith Hernandez going to the Hall of Fame is that he is to first base what Brooks Robinson was to third base. I watched him every day from the time he got to the Mets in '83 until he left. I think it was '89 or '90 when he went to Cleveland for his last year. And I had never seen any first baseman like him before, and haven't seen a first baseman as not just defensively proficient, but how he commandeered the entire field. He made Doc.
And he was also the leader of the team.
That's what I was saying. Is he made Doc Gooden better earlier because he was an on-field coach, even more so than Gary Carter. And he made all those guys, like all those pitchers, had better years because they had Hernandez behind them, seeing pitches, seeing seeing what hitters' tendencies were, seeing what was happening in the field and positioning. He was just incredible to watch.
They talk about people or teams being a team of destiny. And they talk about like Orioles magic. I remember that when I was a kid. I'm sure every team had Padres magic. I don't know, but we had Orioles magic. I'm sure everyone had magic. But there is some magic. And if you watch that ESPN 30 for 30 about the Mets, it's magic. I mean, there was like they were not going to lose. No. They could be down like 3-0, and it would be a bloop or just whatever, a ground ball with a high, whatever it was, a dying quail. Like God, I don't want to say God. I don't know how this works, and I don't know why God would care about Major League Baseball and the supernatural, but I believe that there is some force we do not understand at play sometimes in sports. And I'm telling you, man, I think the 86 Mets, there was something special. There was some magic happening there.
So I never thought of this analogy until, as it applies to baseball, until just now. But Glenn Close was not only a great film actress, she was a great stage actress. And I got to hear her in a small setting one time. And she talked about certain performances and then certain productions. When the productions would happen, she could sustain this thing. And the way she described it was when you really know it because you're, she said, disturbing the molecules. In the theater, in the live theater, there's something that's happening when you're really, living out the imaginary world that the writer envisioned. And you're breathing full life into that character and working really well off of the other characters in that play. And the audience is a part of that experience, that living experience. She said, disturbing the molecules. When a team comes together the way they did, all those different characters, and each one is playing their role just at the right way and filling in those guys. It's got to be something along those lines where they're just disturbing the molecules exactly the right way to get those dying quells to fall to,
Something, yeah. And again, maybe it's just in hindsight, it seems like it was always destined. But like I feel like the Red Sox in '86 were just they were the I forget what it's called in professional wrestling, not the heel, but I guess the heel. Yeah. Like they were there to be beaten. And, I once or twice a year, I watch Kirk Gibson's at bat against Dennis Eckersley in the '88 World Series with Vin Scully.
Oh, man.
Calling it. So good.
I will say that whenever the Mets came out to L.A., I would listen to the Dodgers feed because Vin Scully was just such a pleasure to listen to.
And it's Vin Scully and Joe Garagiola.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And both of them, I mean, in totally different ways, just killing it. But if you watch that at bat, I mean, there are balls at some point. I think he's down 0-2.
He's down 0-2, yeah.
And he's just fouling balls off, just barely getting a piece of a couple of these balls, just staying alive. I mean, if he's off by a millimeter, the game's over. You know what I mean? And yet it seems like it could not have gone any other way. Like this was destined to happen.
Absolutely. Well, this was a real pleasure. So before we go, I mentioned all the different things that you're doing, your column at the Daily Beast, your 2 podcasts, the book. So how can we follow you, find you online, your columns, your podcast, the new book, and all the great work that you're doing?
All right. So definitely read me at the Daily Beast, and I write something like 3 columns a week. Check that out. Follow me on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Check out my podcast, Matt Lewis and the News. And please get the book, Filthy Rich Politicians.
Perfect. And we'll be sure to put all those links in the show notes so it's easy to click through and find all that stuff. Really worth the read. And I just really enjoy visiting with you, Matt. This is a ton of fun for me. Hey, I just realized,
but it's fun.
When I come back out there, we had Denver Riggleman on the show a few months ago, and he has an open invitation. I don't know if you're a whiskey drinker, but he gave us an open invitation to either, depending on which one you're closer to, he has one in Pennsylvania and one distillery. It's his wife's distillery, actually. She's the only female master distiller in that whole area. So one is in the western part of Virginia, I think south of where West Virginia would be, and one is up in Pennsylvania. So I'll give you the heads up. Maybe we can crash his.
Let me know.
Crash it together.
I think we'd love to go.
That would be fun.
If we can.
That would be a ton of fun.
That's right up our alley.
I'll give you the heads up, and I'm sure Denver will make a point of being there to give us crap and drink us under the table. Anyway, well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks again, Matt. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, hit the subscribe button, leave that review like I mentioned before, and comments wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a friend about TPNR. We're easier to recommend than ever. politicsandreligion.us. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. You can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E, S as in Sam, at Corey S. Nathan. Now go talk some politics and religion and maybe a little baseball and theater and method acting with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.